Hey, it's Will from Learnerator, and in this edition of AP Micro Mondays, we're going to look at how shifts in supply and demand interact with one another. So, when dealing with shifts in supply and demand, the good thing is that both respective shifts can only go up or down. And so that means that there are really four scenarios that we come across in this sort of situation. And so oftentimes on the micro exam, you're going to be tested on your ability to identify these shifts as well as the implications of these shifts. So let's first think about scenario number one. So scenario number one may be the situation in which we have a decrease in demand as well as a decrease in supply. So the way I'm going to map this out is by drawing your typical supply and your typical supply and demand curves by mapping out the price and the quantity. So in this case, I have a downward shift in the supply. So in other words, a leftward shift. And then I have a downward shift in the demand. In other words, a leftward shift. So here, the supply curve, just to change the color so that it's a little more clear, supply curve is moving up to the left, and then the demand curve is going down to the left. And so here, what we want to look at is we want to essentially see what has happened to the equilibriums. So as always, when it's addressing these questions, you want to look at where supply intersects demand. So supply 1 intersects demand 1 here, and then supply 2 intersects demand 2 here. And so when comparing these two respective things, we see that there's been one very clear market shift. However, there's an ambiguous shift in one variable. So here, let's first look at the situation in which supply 1 equaled demand 1. That is Q1. And then here we have Q2. Here we can see that it's a leftward shift. However, in terms of price, it seems like the price change is very ambiguous. So what this means is that in this situation, we have definitely a downward shift in quantity. However, we have an ambiguous shift in terms of price, right? Because we don't clearly see what the impact of the two market changes is on the actual equilibrium price. And so what we need to know a little bit more about is, is the specifics about the market, right? If the supply curve, for example, were really inelastic or really elastic, or vice versa with the demand. So this is the first scenario in which we have a decrease in demand as well as a decrease in supply. We experience a downward shift of the quantity, however, an ambiguous shift in the price. So now let's think about scenario number 2, in which we may have the situation where we have a demand that goes up and a supply that goes up. Well, in this case, we have our standard price and quantity axes. We have the two demand curves as well as the two supply curves. And then just labeling these, we have S1 here, S2 here, and then we have D1 here and D2 here. And then what we can see is that here we're moving down to the right. Here we're moving up to the right. And then again, where supply intersects demand, that happens here and that happens here. And so what you can see here, and it's a little bit harder to tell just because of the way I drew this, but what you can tell is that the overall change in the price is kind of still ambiguous, right? Like if you were to consider these two changes, it's very hard to tell what the influence of the price was in terms of the shifts in the actual market. However, what you can clearly tell is that the quantity has gone up. So there's a rightward shift here. So the conclusion for this one is that quantity has gone up. However, again, price is ambiguous. And so what's the key takeaway here? Well, the key takeaway is this. In the situation in which demand and supply are moving in the same direction, we have a very ambiguous influence on price, whereas the quantity is a definite change. However, when demand and supply interact and move in the same direction of one another, it seems that there's an ambiguous change in the price. And so that's the key takeaway in these first two examples. So now let's look at another example in which we have the demand and the supply going in opposite directions. All right, so let's look at scenario number 3, in which we may have a downward demand shift and an upward supply shift. In this case, we can draw our standard P and Q. We can draw our supply curve, our demand curve, and what we know is that supply is going down and to the right, whereas demand is coming in to the left. And so here we see that supply has gone down and that demand has gone down, or supply has gone out and then demand has gone down. And so what we can look at is again where supply equals demand. Supply intersects demand here, and then supply intersects demand here. And so here we see almost like an opposite effect, right? Because here the quantity appears more or less the same. However, it seems that our price has gone down. And so what we see in this situation is we essentially are experiencing a decrease in price, but an ambiguous decrease in price, but an ambiguous change in quantity. So that's the key takeaway in that scenario. Now let's look at the last scenario in which we have the opposite of this, so a rightward demand shift and a inward supply shift. So in this case, drawing our standard diagram. So here we know that the supply is going down, so moving up to the left. And then what we also know is that the demand is going outwards to the right. And so here, if we look at the direction here, we can see where it intersects. Supply 1 intersects demand 1 here. Supply 2 intersects demand 2 here. Again, there's that very ambiguous change in the quantity, however, a very clear change in the price. And so here we see that the price goes up, however, there's an ambiguous change in the quantity. So what's the summary here? Well, what's really important and the key takeaway is essentially when the demand and the supply are moving in different directions, you will come across a change in the price, however, an ambiguous change in the quantity. So it's kind of the opposite outcome of the first two examples we did in this situation in which there was an ambiguous change in the price, however, there was a definite change in the quantity. So these are just things to consider in terms of addressing questions where you'll be asked about shifts in supply and in demand. That covers it for this time. I will see you guys next time.